On this day, temperatures were in the mid-20s. Don and I hiked 19 miles to winter camp at the Betonia camp, and then camped out overnight and hiked 12 miles out the next day. And there's some very basic things I learned from Don that day. Things that I probably took for granted, hope to pass on to you so you don't make these same mistakes I did. One is, when you first start out, it's cold in the morning. So don't overdress when you start hiking, because once you overdress, you're going to have to take that layer or layers off, which means you have to carry them. And when you got a 45-pound backpack and you're hiking 19 miles, which is a lot for me, you want to pack smart, and extra gear isn't smart. So maybe that first mile, before you really warm up, you're going to be a little bit cold, but you will warm up. The second thing is, dressing warmly is important, but dressing smartly is even more important. The old phrase is cotton kills. You can't wear clothes that when you do sweat, it keeps the moisture. You have to wear wicking clothes, and all the good outdoor stores certainly sell them. Also, I learned from Don that if you wash your wicking clothes in normal detergent, that wicking absorption will go away. He told me there's a detergent called Nikwax out there. I still have to buy it and still have to use it. That keeps that wicking action. And also, if you've already washed in the detergent that takes away the wicking, if you do wash with Nikwax, it will bring it back. Great tip from Don. The other thing I learned from Don too is your toes are probably going to be cold a little bit in the beginning. It's great when you're hunting to have the toe warmers because you're standing still. But if you use toe warmers when you're actually hiking, your feet are going to overheat, your feet are going to sweat, and again, sweating isn't good, especially in the cold weather. So warm up by walking, not by extra layers, and not by toe warmers. The other thing I learned from Don when we broke for camp was you need to pack in order. And it makes sense to pack your sleeping gear, your tent at the bottom of your backpack, and then work your way up with what you're going to need on that hike. For example, packing your lunch at the very top, it's easy to get to. With cold hands and you're tired, you don't want to be going all through your backpack to get your lunch or to get something you might need, a flashlight or your multi-tool or even a little snack. Obviously your water has to be at your disposal at all times too. And you also need to know, when you're hiking and it's winter, how to make a snowball. Now, here's how you make a snowball. You get snow, you squeeze it tight, and you throw it. Some more tips for winter camping, and I learned this. You might think you know how to set up your tent quickly in the summertime. It's different in the winter. For example, my tent, a half-dome tent, had clips for the poles to go through, which I thought, but actually they should have went through the sleeves, and the clips were for the fly. So I did it backwards, and it cost me time. And when you're tired and it's cold out and it's dark, you want to go right through the motion real quick and get the tent up, get by the fire, and eat. So it's really smart the night before just to set up the tent again so you know what you're doing. Of course, to make sure all the gear's there also. The other thing you really need to do when you winter camp, and I outsmarted myself here, I just brought my 3 Seasons sleeping bag, which is only to 35 degrees. Well, it went down into the 20s. I figured that might happen, so I brought my bivy sack, and I put my sleeping bag inside the bivy sack for the extra warmth. It did work. I was warm overnight, but again, you're carrying extra gear. So if you're winter camping, like Don had, he had a -20 bag, and he was fine. Don taught me this too, that you are going to sweat a little bit when you hike, especially 19 miles. So your gear is going to be a little bit wet, your undergarments, even the wicking. He said to put it at the foot of the sleeping bag inside the bag because your body warmth in the bag is going to dry out that gear. I did it that night, and both layers of socks and my shirts were both warm the next morning, and I could put them back on, and I really didn't need a second gear for the next day. I could have packed lighter by keeping it warm overnight. It was great advice by Don. I also figured if I'm bringing my clothes in, I might as well bring all my gear in the tent. Because in the morning when you're packing your bags and your cooking equipment, it's just easier handling all the stuff when it's warm. I have a 2-person tent, a half dome, so it was easier. If you have a single person tent or if you're sleeping in a hammock, obviously you can't do that. Lastly, you want to really sleep off the ground as high as you can. I learned this from Don. I just had a cell pad and I rolled it out, but he said I also needed one of those blow-up pads, and he had an extra one. He let me use it. Thanks, Don. And it really made a big difference because there's so much coldness in the ground. You hear the people that do the hammock sleeping at nights. They tie a hammock. It's kind of like a mummy bag, and they're off of the ground. But it's the wind that gets underneath of them, and that's the big concern. So whether you're sleeping off of the ground or on the ground, you really, really want warmth. And if it's going to take an extra pad, it's worth bringing it because you're going to be cold if you're not off the ground. Each week we also have my little double use theory. I like to get double use out of all my equipment. And if you can see what I'm wearing today, and this is an old jacket. There's much newer, better jackets, but it's worked over the years for me. It's a double use. You have the insulation underneath. It's all part of one jacket I bought, and you have the outer shell for moisture. Over the years, it's really worked well. I can wear this in the spring and the fall, stay warm. I can just use the outer shell when it's raining. And together, like in the winter, cold days like today, you can use them both, and it keeps you warm, the layers. I also do the same with gloves, insulated gloves, but I'll wear the glove liners to stay warm on cold days, cold winter camping. If you remember the great Sir John Franklin, explorer for England in the great age of exploration in the 1800s, he went to look for a Northwest Passage from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Obviously, it's a big deal back then. It would make shipping much cheaper and less time to get to the West Coast. Well, Sir John Franklin was stranded up in Canada, and he had a winter there. And him and his 128 men were wintering around the Inuits who lived there, and they lived in relatively plenty. However, Sir John Franklin and his 128 men, they all perished that winter, every single one of them. And their epitaph was quite tragic for this great man. It said he died of rigid thought, because as the Inuits lived in relatively plenty around him and his men tried to live like Europeans in the Arctic. And they ended up dying. And they wouldn't change to live like the Inuits, the native people of that land who have been living there for centuries upon centuries. And the point of the story is to be open-minded. When people like Don McNamee have tips for you, don't act like you know it all or are too proud to use his tips, because they really make a difference. And you can learn from other people out there. Hopefully you'll learn from this podcast. I hope to keep learning too. Thanks for listening.